although you probably all know this, that's why it's going to be very brief. And then we are going to run through a few images with no comment, and then we'll get into the questions. And then we will possibly go back to some of the images if Howard wants to speak about specifics. So, well, Howard is a native Houstonian. It's a somewhat rare bird, and so he's pretty much recognized as a leader among a new generation of contemporary artists within Texas circles. And one of his paintings was chosen as the cover for Texas Abstract Modern / Contemporary Art by Michael Pegley and Jim Edwards. And Howard's going to hold up the book now. Okay, so he has shown widely Texas, California, New York, Florida, as well as Spain, India, and Peru. And a piece is on permanent display at Bush Intercontinental Airport, correct? And in his paintings, Howard works on a very large scale, up to 7 feet, or 7 feet tall, 9 feet tall, can't count. He recently has been working on unstretched canvas and adding paper as a sculptural element. He also does small pieces on like 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper that he's going to speak about that. And as we go through the work, it's really a mix of many styles: expressionist painting, drawing, geometric abstraction, cartoonish figures, color fill painting, trompe-l'oeil, and collage. So it's sort of a postmodern twist on 20th century modernism. He describes his work as gestural mark-making meets cartoonish references. Others describe it as explosive, excessive, ambitious, and hedonistic.
Wow.
And we talked a lot, the two of us, but I like the statement. He said, in the end, the most significant things that have happened to me are due to the work itself. So we're going to pretty much focus on the work. And also I want to just mention that he'll be leaving Houston in the morning because he has an opening tomorrow night in Chelsea at Field Projects Gallery, which is a curator-run space. So he may talk a little bit about that when we get to talking about New York. Can you all hear me? Okay, we're going to pass the microphone back and forth. So when you were an undergraduate studying painting at UT Austin, you began drawing a daily comic strip for the Daily Texan. Can you talk about how that, we're going to run through the paintings first. Lisa, can you just quickly go through the work? And
do you want to speak a little bit about each one?
I don't think so. I think this is a large painting, an earlier work.
We can toggle back to one too.
Yeah, we'll come back to these. This is a smaller piece on paper. That's a smaller piece. You can see it's kind of metaphysical Batman, lurching and cursing in a field of tulips. The Cynical Mystic, number 19. 44 Ways to Get Paid. Okay, so let's go back to talking about, I know that for about 6 years, Howard was determined to become the next Bloom Country or whatever as a cartoonist, right? Peanuts, right. So, and so it's very interesting to hear him talk about that process, how it's affected his work even to this day.
Thank you. Really quick, before I get into it, I want to thank everyone for being here, and Donna and Lisa and the Visual Arts Alliance for having us. I got a lot of old friends in the audience. Some of y'all I haven't seen in a while. Thank you for coming. And since we go way back, if you catch a little glare from my badass hairstyle, don't be shy. I'll pivot, okay? Anyway, so you basically want to talk a little bit about the cartooning. I started out I did a daily comic strip when I was an undergraduate at UT in Austin, and after finishing that, I self-syndicated it to about, 17 or 19 newspapers, mostly college newspapers, around the country until I got to a point in the late 90s where I got tired of being on a daily deadline, and we can come back to it a little bit later, but I've slowly moved into this sort of more contemporary art, fine art world that we're in now. But you wanted me to talk a little bit about how that's influenced what the work is like now.
Yes.
And so basically when you're on a daily deadline, for something in that medium, number one, there's an incredible amount of discipline needed when you're cranking out a daily comic strip, but also because the picture or what you're drawing, the visuals are sharing real estate with a word balloon, every line counts. And also the artwork is shrunk down to the size of a postage stamp, whether it's going in a physical newspaper, newsprint, or towards the end of my time, they were scanning them in and putting them on the newspaper's website. So there was a real economy to mark making that you had to learn quickly and start making every mark count. And that's probably something subconsciously that I've very much carried with me to this day, even though the work can at times be pretty busy and noisy. And then that sort of black line is something that continues on through the work, and I draw back into the paintings. If you want to put any of them up, no matter whether it's something like this from back in 2008 to something more recent that we'll get to, I always solve a lot of problems in the paintings by drawing back into them, or some sort of mark making influence by drawing that comes back into them. And it all stems from those days. And then probably something I hadn't thought about in a while, but also, there was the joke, the word balloon, the joke writing in those days was almost more important, if not more important than the visuals, because you're going to read from left to right, top to bottom, before you look at the picture most of the time in a comic strip, in a newspaper comic strip rather. And so there was a real interest in writing funny things, keeping the words, or the amount of words relatively brief. And there's definitely been an ongoing interest in text and language that I haven't really just paid attention to because it's so much a part of me, but something I've been recently conscious of again. And that's probably where some of the titles come from and some of their thoughts. And I scribble lots of random notes back into a lot of the work. It's very hard to see. It's very hard to see on the display here, but there's a lot of scribbling back into them that way, and dictation and that sort of thing. So everyone can hear me, right?
So 10 years after graduating from UT, Howard returned to school to the University of North Texas to get his Master of Fine Arts in Painting and Drawing, and that was in 2006. And so I wanted him to talk a little bit about that experience, and maybe he had some very influential professors that you may or may not know because they're Dallas-based, but they're well-known, like Vernon Fisher and Robert Jessup. And
So yeah, I finished in 2006, but it was a real perfect storm when I got there. I was there at the right time. I'd had 10 years off since undergraduate, so I'd had a bunch of really crappy jobs that I hated and grown up a little bit. And so I was very much at the right time, right place, right faculty, right peers. And I kind of fell ass backwards into that school. It was the last place I applied, and I hadn't missed the deadline, but it was the best thing that ever happened. And I worked with Vernon Fisher. I was his last student. He was my major professor. I was his last student before he retired. It was a very, very challenging experience, but it paid off tremendously. And the rest of the painting faculty was really great too. I worked a lot with Ed Blackburn as well. These are both very substantial Texas-based artists. They're both in Fort Worth, and you can see their work in museums and everything. And Vincent Falsetta and Jessup, and they all brought a little something different to the table. But from where I was at that point in my life, it helped that I was working with a lot of real seasoned veterans. And there were a couple of younger professors that I took classes with too that were very, very bright and helpful as well. But like the core group that I was with the most of the time, these are guys who'd been at it a really long time, very well respected artists, and it was like a damp rag that I wrung dry while I was there. I figured, if I'm going to take out these student loans to do this and go through this, and it was a hard time. I'm not going to get into all of it, but it was a hard time for me to leave Houston at that point for personal family reasons and stuff, but I did it. And but yeah, it was just I got everything out of it. I left it all on the field there. We worked really hard. We played really hard. I had some really intellectually rigorous engagements there. And consequently, when I finished, just as I was finishing, not just me, but there were several other people I was finishing with who had a lot of success right out of school. Their last semesters of school, things started to happen for them. And that was the part when I was talking about the right peer group, you know. So we really pushed. There were a lot of us in that core group who were in our late 20s, early 30s at the time, who'd had those enough life had chewed them up and spit them out a little bit, which made a big difference, you know. And then there were consequently a couple of younger artists there who were very capable and had plenty of ability, but like, you know, they didn't appreciate it. They took a year off, or they went straight from undergrad. And I'm not saying that's a hard and fast rule, but you know, now they're not doing anything. So anyway.
When Howard got his MFA in 2006, he made a commitment to live off of his work, and you know how frightening that can be. And he can address that, but also he did move back to Houston, and so I wanted to ask him, how did that influence his work and launch his more mature career?
Coming back here was a really wonderful thing. At the time I was finishing school, a lot of people, there were professors saying move to Brooklyn or move to Berlin at that particular moment in time, 12 years ago. And, you know, obviously things have changed and places have gentrified and gotten more expensive and all that. But one of the best things about being here specifically, and it's very distinctively, I think it's very unique to Houston, is that no one really asks you, when you want to do something, they don't ask you why, they ask you why not. I start to think that might be sort of a historical vibe of the city coming. I mean, historically, this is a wildcatter, blue collar kind of oil town where you come here to reinvent yourself or strike it rich from 100 years ago or whatever. And maybe indirectly that still is in the air or in the water. I can't confirm that, but I definitely always got a sense of that. And everyone was terribly friendly, and most importantly, studio space was really cheap. And you can still find cheapish studio space here. But yeah, so that was the big benefit. I also had a lot of old friends and family here. And we can get into it a little bit later, but I kind of had sold a little bit of work before graduate school, not much, but I kind of, I already started a very lame email list or mailing list even back then. And so, it was a bunch of little things that brought me back, but I knew that I knew that it would be easier to come to a comfortable place to do something incredibly challenging than to try and just go somewhere else. And I knew that I wanted to buy back as much time as possible in the studio. And that's kind of all I kind of knew. I figured out a lot really quickly, but so I think some of those things I'm referring to about Houston still ring true, So, and I'm reminded of that now that I'm in New York.
Cheap space.
Yeah.
Yeah, Houston has cheap space compared to the coast. And okay, so I'd like to focus on the work a little more. And in the earlier pieces, we're not going back too far. How far back are we going?
2007, 2008, 2008, no, like that one's 2008.
So in these are basically flat, right?
Yes.
So I wanted him to talk a little bit about that. And when his work made a dramatic shift and started to pop off the canvas, and he started applying paper, and it got very three-dimensional. As some of them are as deep as 11 inches. So I think he talks a little. I want him to talk about this work and then how and why that happened.
Totally, yeah. Okay, so I I think just as you work and work and work and make more work, you get more comfortable with what you're doing, right? And so, basically, I got to a point where I felt like I had a very, very specific visual language, and I wanted to start taking what was once a noun and turning it into a pronoun, taking the pronoun and turning it into an adverb, and the adverb into the verb, and the prepositional phrase into the noun, etc. You see what I'm saying? So that was part of the shift in the work from things being really flat to things being more sculptural or tactile, which we'll look at in a minute. And also I grew out of this perpetual art school need to let everyone know everything I know in every single piece. And I'd worked through, like I said a minute ago, I'd kind of worked through a lot of issues in the work by just cranking away every day. And the work started to feel a little bit, at least internally, a little bit more distilled and a little bit more sophisticated and simple in a way, even though things were starting to get more raw and physical. And I had a growing interest in the physicality of the material. Why is that? I don't, that's a...
talked about Chamberlain.
Yeah, and then around the same time, I'd always had an interest in a lot of people mark making and drawing in unusual ways, whether it's abstract expressionists or color field painters or stain painters or whatever. I was never very interested, even at the beginning of graduate school, in recreating photography and painting, or doing hyper-realistic things like that. So, but also when the work really started to get a little, like these are still early. This is the piece from the museum show in 2008. Maybe we'll jump to something, just keep clicking, yeah, even that, fuck the buttons, give me the zipper. That's from 2013, where that one protrudes 9 inches off the surface. But what happened was around 2013, I got asked to give a talk about the John Chamberlain sculpture in the Manil collection. Right before that, I had given a talk at the Cy Twombly Gallery across the street about the relationship between the Renzo Piano building and the Twombly artwork within the building, which was also, both of those lectures had a real, the arc of both of those lectures had a lot to do with the material and the physicality of the material. And then around that time, went out with some friends in the audience, went out to the John Chamberlain Museum to do research for the Manil talk. I went out to the John Chamberlain Museum in Marfa. And so, taking notes, talking about these things, and I stress talking again because talking and verbalizing and articulating is really, really important. That sort of led me to doing work like this. It's very three-dimensional, very sculptural, very tactile, although it's still a two-dimensional painting hanging on the wall. And for me, using paper and then these more recent ones, canvas, has a sort of a spontaneity, a gestural sort of spontaneity and permissibility to it that really suits my temperament when I'm actually physically working in the studio, not sitting around thinking and analyzing so much, When I feel, as an example, if I were to sort of try and put things together in a way that feels like it's one building block on top of another, like an erector set or a material that would slow me down a little bit, maybe even clay at a certain point, I lose patience with it, and this could change as I mellow over the years, but right now, that's not really where I'm at. So I hope did I answer the question?
Did he answer it?
You realize some people don't mellow as they grow older.
I can tell. It's
let-
okay.
Let's, I have to say, when I first saw these pieces, I was like, no. It took me a while because I just loved the earlier pieces so much, but, I like these now, so it's just a matter of getting over the shock, I guess. Can you talk about the small works on paper? You said they were portraits, and people may not realize that and how they influence the larger work.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of the work, you can make out some sort of a figurative reference, which is funny. This book's called Texas Abstract, and you can kind of make out rows of teeth and maybe a head or a couple of eyes on the cover. But I do find a lot of cartoonish. It might be indirect, but I find a lot of cartoonish figurative references in a lot of the work, or I find some place to, I find some way to get back to that. But, so I'm sorry, your question was?
That's a portrait, right?
Yeah, I find them all to be,
sort of.
I find them all to be indirectly to be portraits, yeah. So, not as much with the big ones, but definitely with the little ones. Sometimes with the big ones too. And the little works have kind of recently become my drawing practice. And the little ones influence the big ones, and the big ones tend to influence the little ones. And I've got them both going at the same time in the studio. So, yeah, I think it's important to always be drawing, and I tend to start and stop the little ones very quickly, which suits a certain temperament, because the larger pieces can take a month or two sometimes, especially if I'm working on multiple ones at the same time. So it's very appeasing and soothing to have these little things cooking at the same time.
Okay, let's press on. Howard moved to New York about a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
So I wanted him to talk about why he moved to New York, and he's going to talk about sort of moving out of his comfort zone, and also his daily routine when he's in New York, and his studio in East Harlem.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, but you kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, I moved there for a lot of reasons, but one of the most important one is probably just because I wanted to put myself in a state of uncomfortable pressure, and you're definitely not in your comfort zone most of the time. At least I'm not in my comfort zone most of the time in New York. I just felt the need for a change. I could finally, I'd been thinking about it for a while. I could finally afford to do it. And I do still have a studio and a place here. And yeah, I mean, and I don't know. I mean, it was just, I needed a change. I had a lot of wonderful success here and a few other spots around the country, but it just felt like now was the time to do it, and a bunch of other things lined up. And it kind of came to a point where if I don't do it now, I'm not going to do it, So,
So talk about what you do every day.
and what I do every day. Tutor, wake up for this. Every day, my routine's not that terribly different in one city or the other. Every day I get up, and the first part of the day is probably, the first part of the day and the very end of the day, or sometimes I'm dealing with email and social media things and phone calls, returning phone calls or whatever. And then the middle of the day, usually the afternoon into the evening, here in Houston, late into the evening, most evenings, I'm working in the studio, New York, because I'm still new to New York and I'm still trying to meet people, I am cutting out and going to a tremendous amount of lectures and openings almost every night. And I don't know, I mean, that's sort of the strategy now. My strategy will change as time goes on, and you got to be ready to be a little bit fluid with things, but that's sort of been the routine. But the general routine hasn't changed all that much. It's just from between Houston and New York, it's just on steroids in New York, it's just because there's so much more, So every day, yeah, I'm just working every day. So I don't have any magic bullets or secrets. It's just a lot of work.
I'm as an art writer, I kind of get frustrated when artists don't have titles, and I understand sometimes they number them and things like that, but I really appreciate it when the titles are creative, and Howard's titles are very creative. High Priest from the Pagan Days, Slaving Away at the iPhone Factory, Bloated Prices and Small Ideas, and of course the official explainer hired to explain things. So could you talk about how you come up with your titles?
You forgot alcohol and night swimming. I come up with my titles in a bunch of different ways. The New York Times is a great resource. Song titles, spam, yeah, anything I'm reading. Sometimes the titles can be very philosophical. Sometimes they song that's out of a song lyric. 44 Ways to Get Paid. They can sometimes be very philosophical and spiritual. Sometimes the titles have everything to do with the work. Sometimes the titles have nothing to do with the work. It's pretty random. I'm just looking for something interesting to entertain myself with the title most of the time. And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't read that much into all of them. There are moments where there are some that are very specific to certain pieces, and then like this one has nothing to do with that piece. I just like the song lyric. Yeah. So.
I'm not sure, we've kind of covered this, but what sacrifices have you made personally, and have you made any missteps or things that you regret over the course of your career that might help the artists in the crowd?
Okay, so the first part was
What
sacrifices. Money. That's a big sacrifice, and as you get older, you realize that there's a certain kind of something that I'm realizing recently is there's a certain kind of freedom that can come with money. So especially before, there was very little money, and it was very, very hard for a very long time, up until recently, the last couple of years. So that was a big sacrifice. I work all the time, and I'm convinced that working all the time is the reason why things have. God, it's just so easy. Everyone knows this, I mean, when you work all the time, you could be a business entrepreneur, you could be a plumber, you could be a dentist, you could be whatever. I mean, if you're going to work all the time, yes, work hard and work smart, but you have to incorporate those too. But that when you're doing that, it takes away from other areas of your life. So your personal life is going to take a hit. You have to have understanding friends and family. You're going to be busy. I'm pretty good about making time for things, but yeah, your personal life it can take a toll on your personal life when you're trying to build anything, right? I'm sorry. Lessons learned. I don't have any regrets. I feel like I've learned from most of the things I've screwed up on, and I've screwed up on a lot of things. I really don't have any regrets. One thing I might have talked to Lisa or you about previously before tonight's talk is, when I didn't really know what I was doing, I was pretty pushy and aggressive, and maybe that turned some people off. But in hindsight, I'm very glad that I've incorporated those traits and been a little bit, maybe tempered them a little as I've matured and gotten older, because those are sort of been incredibly helpful in how I've moved forward in the world. I don't think that anyone's gonna, I think that you've got to do for yourself. As my friend Bob in the audience would say, you got to be the driver, and I think he's right. I mean, no one's going to do it for you. So, that's me speculating on things I might have been better at if I would have known better. I was kind of pushing before I even had a clue, And there's a lot of old work way before graduate school that I kind of look at and I cringe, but I think that happens with a lot of people. But yeah, so.
Yeah, that's good.
You've done a lot of residencies, more than half a dozen, 6 to 8 residencies, month-long. Virginia Center for Creative Arts, Vermont Studio Center, various residencies, and I thought maybe you would talk a little bit about that. It seems to me like it would be a wonderful thing for an artist. Do you recommend those?
I think they're great. I don't regret doing them. And actually, one thing that's come up recently is, I've been moving around studios, And after doing all these residencies, you get very comfortable quickly in a new space and get to work really quickly. And that came from doing a lot of residencies. I think residencies are a really great way to sort of change your environment and focus on the work. There are other artists in the audience who've done residencies, and I'm fairly certain that they'd agree with me about that. I kind of try and go to ones where they're free and they're going to pay me, or at least they're free. I don't like to pay. So, but there are all kinds of residencies out there, some that you pay and some that you don't. And if you really feel like you need to get away and really focus on the work in most of the time, a pretty quiet, secluded environment, they're really great. The other byproduct of doing them is that I've met a lot of other artists who I've stayed in touch with at various residencies. And those were the only people I knew when I got to New York, were a handful of other artists that I met at various residencies around the country. So it gave me a few people to hang out with. But yeah, I totally recommend them. And sometimes I've been to ones where it's just visual artists, and there's other times where I've been to them and they've had writers, poets, novelists, etc. The Wurlitzer, when I was a Wurlitzer fellow, that was a long one for 3 months in Taos, New Mexico. They brought in a composer, so his studio had a grand piano in it. It was kind of cool. To cross-pollinate with people from other arts is a really interesting thing when you're like me and you're spending your time mostly with other visual artists making painting and sculpture. So.
Recently you worked with Flatbed Press in Austin, and you made your first prints. You did lithographs and monoprints. Can you talk about that experience?
Interesting. I've been going really long there, so I figured I'd throw y'all a curveball and wake up Chris. Anyway, I had never done prints. They seemed really cool. I felt the need to. For a while. I felt it'd be a good thing to try and collaborate. I don't really collaborate. Tudor, a friend of mine in the audience, had been by the studio and made a comment that was ruminating in my head about the repetitive process of making the same size things or something that feels similar on a daily basis. I don't remember exactly how he said it. I will the minute I get off the mic, but
Right.
It wasn't nearly that sweet. Anyway, yeah, I wanted to try collaborating. They were really great. I vaguely remembered doing a student tour there in the 90s, but or in a different building. But I'm really glad I had the experience. It was a really interesting experience. I'd maybe do it again, but the one thing is they're a little bit like some photographers in the sense that they can very much be kind of gadget people. And the printmaster who I worked with was great. I felt like I should be taking notes the whole time, and I wasn't. But they're very much about the process and the mechanisms to make the process, and they're very interested in all the specifics related to every ink and every press. And it's like it's almost like going into a garage, with mechanics and stuff like that. And I'm all about vibe, or I try and be as much about vibe as I possibly can in my own work. And, I'm neurotic and it shows in the work, and I'm kind of emotional, it shows in the work. And they've got like processes in place, and we have to take turns and go in tandem during those processes. So I liked it. I would do it again. But it doesn't totally suit my temperament or my nature instinctively at this point, But I got some good results, and yeah, so.
Well, it gives you some more affordable work, right? The whole idea of an edition. So can you talk about the sizes of the pieces, like how many you did?
The prints?
Mm-hmm.
The prints weren't that big. They're on, I don't think we can pull up, I don't know if we can pull up a web browser. I put a few in the shopping cart page on my website, but there were I think 15 3/4 inches by maybe 27 inches. They're not that big, and the materials they used were, they're really, this is maybe the best print shop in the state, or one of them, and they work with all the Texas artists that you've heard of. And there was a James Searle show that was up, that was coming down while I was there, and some great Trentway Hancocks and John Alexanders and a bunch of other people, but the materials they chose were very thoughtful and very high end, and that was really great. I'm not implying that I don't work with good materials when I'm working by myself. That's not the case. But if you go down to shop, yeah, there's some at the bottom of the shop page. Yeah, so they were very considerate. The printmaster was very considerate of the way that I already work. She picked out paper with a perforated edge along the bottom because that's already what I work with in my own smaller works that you'll see when this page comes up. She used my color palette, which I have a pretty, it's not necessarily intentional, but I have a pretty specific color palette. There's a lot of black, there's a lot of turquoise, there's a lot of tangerine, there's a lot of hot pink. And so she sort of kept that in mind before I even showed up. So there was pre-inked paper, they didn't leave like a mint on my pillow and a warm towel or something like that. But it felt a little bit that way in the sense that they were really cool. These are all my own little works on paper. And then when you go all the way to the bottom, you start to see the prints. And you can tell pretty quickly that they feel a little different. Like these are all monoprints. Again, interesting experience. It's not something that comes naturally to me. It's very fluid though. I mean, I'm sure there are a million other ways to do this sort of stuff. So.
Kind of in closing before we open it up to questions, can you talk a little bit about how you've matured and how it's affected your work and how you work differently now that you're, 20 years in or something like that? More than 20?
How I've matured. I feel like I've gotten to know myself better. No, I have, actually. I think we all have, right? Haven't we? If there's one thing I notice right away, there's a little bit more restraint in my work, and it's less polychromatic, still a little less noisy, a little less busy for the sake of being busy than when I first started out. So I think that's one way that I've matured. A little less in, like what I alluded to earlier, and letting everyone know everything that I know with every single piece. And you see that when I do a lot of visiting artists. I don't do a lot. I guess I do about one a year on average. Visiting artist gigs at different universities or art schools, and you see it. It's a very common problem in student work or younger artist work, and maybe not just artists, but everyone's work, where you're just sort of developing, and you want to show off to yourself and everyone else what you know. And so there's more restraint now. That's probably the biggest thing, and restraint in a lot of different ways. That's probably how I think I've grown. And as raw and physical as they might feel, they've definitely gotten more sophisticated too. Yeah.
Okay, questions?
Do you think since you're in New York that your style or your attitude will change from what you're doing now?
Wait, tell me, say it.
Do you think that since you're in New York, do I think that since I'm in New York, my attitude and style have changed?
Your style and your thinking, your thought process may be altered or changed or something new or different.
The one thing that's happened is you're exposed to so much. I'm making a point of looking like every day, at least right now. So I'm sure subconsciously or indirectly that's influenced my work. Yeah, but I was already looking a lot anyway. I'm pretty far along. I'm not straight out of art school going there. I'm going there a little further along in my career. It's probably an unusual move for a lot of people, So I wasn't expecting some huge shift because I'm up there, but I'm sure in very indirect ways I'm fine-tuning things due to the fact that I'm just so heavily informed by the mass amount of things that I'm seeing there, I've had a lot of art studio visits with a lot of critics and a lot of other artists, and a couple of gallerists, one gallerist, but it's interesting to hear what they have to say. In a weird way, I've said this to a couple of friends before, but I actually had a very I'm jumping back for a second, and I'm realizing the more time I've spent there, how unique and special my time was when I was at UNT, and what built after that. Because some of those faculty were really impressive, you know, and so it sort of sets the bar very high for a lot of other people that I've met since then. They were, yeah. So I hope I answer your question. It's been a very subtle, indirect shift. I'm sure there has been one, but it's been nominal, quite frankly, you know. Yeah.
I'm a native, by the way.
Oh, cool. How about those Rockets tonight, huh? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious, at what point when you're working on your painting do you give the title? Or do you start to think, this is the title that I'm moving towards, and maybe even you change it at the end, because I can't use that. Just
I wish I had a really sexy answer for you, but sometimes before, sometimes during, sometimes after. There's always a list on the wall. Sometimes that list is there for a year or two, and I assign one later. It really kind of varies. I mean, if there's one thing there that's important that y'all can take away from too, is just always be reading. I'm always trying to read 3 news sources a day. I try and always keep a book going. Good things happen. That I'm realizing, I haven't really said this out loud to anybody, but another obvious thing that I'm just starting to recently realize is that's really where I think my edge will come as I move forward, is just to keep reading more than anything else, you know. That's how I think I'll keep my edge as I become an older and older artist. It's not, at this point, it's probably going to be the most important way, in addition to just continuing to physically work, you know. So.
Yeah, you bring a certain intellectual aura to the paintings.
Thanks, chap. All this time I thought it was just my chiseled features and rugged good looks. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Robert Leroy Hodge in the house.
Since I've been following your work, you know, what I love most about you is that you've been consistent and the work has evolved. So for the artists out there, like, how do you separate personal tragedies and these ups and downs in life to stay focused in the studio? Because a lot of artists that we all love that had made it to the promised land, so we say it's because of divorce or bankruptcy, whatever it might be. Like, how did you put it to the side and just get in the studio and still continue to make that work?
I don't really think about it that much. I just show up and work every day. You know, I don't wait. When you show up and work every day, good things are going to happen. And hey, I don't talk about this. You know, my father passed away a few months. We were close, and he passed away a few months before I went off to graduate school. I didn't want to leave. You know, I didn't want to leave town at that point in time. So, but I showed up to work every day, and that, whether it's that particular thing or or a divorce or a bankruptcy or whatever the tragedy might be that you're alluding to, I think if you show up to work every day, good things are going to happen. And there's a whole field of art therapy, you know, that's out there, you know, for a reason, I guess. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it was very simple, but that sounds easy. That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, you hear all these cliches, you know, not to go off on this, but you hear all these cliches, and sometimes they almost sound romantic about this happened to this artist and they closed the doors and closed shop for a year or two. And I don't really subscribe to that. I mean, personally, and I can't speak for anybody else, and I can only walk in my own shoes in this regard, but I think the majority of the artists I know and that I've met who are doing interesting things or being consistent or in their work are working every day, regardless of what kind of tragedy or circumstance might be happening in their life. You know, they take very little time off. I know very few artists, and I'm sure they're out there. I remember this one guy in graduate school would talk about this, about just sort of thinking all the time and then executing for a short period of time and then going away and thinking a lot. And I'm sure it can work depending on what you're doing, but I think the majority of artists have to kind of physically be making things every day, with few exceptions, you know, drawing every day. Yeah.
So Howard, so if we go back to the late 50s, right, the Ab X painters had developed a style. And then in the early 60s, this group came along and kind of reinvented painting. Okay, so the pop painters, Warhol. And it was totally different. And the older people looked at the new painting and said, we don't get it. You know, we don't really understand it. And I think sometimes with your work, that same thing is happening. Like people look at your work, this three-dimensional work, and say, hey, I don't really get it, I don't understand, because they're using a frame of reference from prior periods. How do you think about that, and how do you continue to make work when there's still a body of people that look at your work and just say, what is this? You know, I don't really understand it.
I made the mistake of saying to Howard, I think you're the best sort of abstract expressionist painting that I've seen in a while. And of course then he explained to me how his work differs, but I spent 5 years doing a thesis on second generation abstract expressionism, and I saw these artists struggling to, after de Kooning and Pollock, struggling to find their way. And so I think Howard could talk about that, and we did talk about it, but we weren't sure we were going to get it into the conversation.
Yeah, and what Bob's sort of alluding to is what the world out there thinks. And I think the artists that you're talking about, maybe they weren't overtly considerate of what anyone else other than themselves was thinking when they were trying to work. And I try and feel the same. I try and subscribe to the same thing. I will make myself crazy if I sit around and fret over who's not getting what I'm doing. So I don't think about them. I mean, I think about them a little, and I complain about it to a few friends, who are several people in this room who are kind enough to listen to me vent probably more than I should. But listen, some people aren't going to get it, and that's probably a good thing. If there are people who don't get it or don't digest it right away, there's a good chance that you're doing something different and you're moving the ball forward, so to speak. And so. I think that's a good thing, I also think that you really can't lose if you're being authentic and doing things that are suited working in a way that suits your personality. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about the end result or the finished product, but I'm talking about the process too. And yeah, I mean, what your question's alluding to is the people who don't get it. Well, fuck them. Will that go on YouTube too?
I'll just wipe that out.
Describe how you found your studio. Are there other artists around you? Just describe your setup.
In New York or in Houston?
New York.
In New York, I am on. I found the studio pretty quickly when I got there, and I found it on, was it Craigslist or one of the art-centric local sites or something like that. And it's the third floor of a kind of a dilapidated building that they're renovating, and they're currently turning the first floor into studios too. But there are 4 or 5 other, there's 4 other, 1, 2, 3, there's 4 other studios on the floor, and I'm usually the only one there. Yeah, and I just realized at an event in New York last week, talking with other artists, that like a lot of them are in Brooklyn in big warehouses, where there's just, it's like Winter Street here, but like times 3, and so more people are around. It's something that's, I'm having to work a little. I really like the space I'm in. I've got the biggest space on the floor with a lot of natural light. I've been getting good results, but I'm realizing that I'm having to work. This isn't anything new. It doesn't scare me, but I'm having to work harder to find that community outside the studio, because it's not hanging around the same hours I am. I'm almost always the only one there. If you want to know the truth, I've felt that way a lot even here at times, regardless of what studio I was in. So take that for whatever that is. But yeah, it's a cool space. It's like everything, 3-flight walk up in this semi-rough, starting to gentrify part of Spanish Harlem. Take the 6, for those of y'all who are familiar with it. Yeah, so.
It's an incredible space.
Yeah.
It's an incredible space.
Yeah, Chap's seen it, yeah. I really like it. I'm in like in the middle of moving into a new space in the Montrose from downtown here too, which has been kind of interesting. So,
I have a question.
yeah.
Just as a coincidence, I've been reading about Vernon Fisher because he's having an opening at Hyman Butler's gallery opening Saturday. So I was reading a little bit about him, and he talks a little bit about his rituals and how he gets started on a painting, what he does. Can you talk a little bit about what you do there? Like how do you get into your
Hope, pray, cry. Tutor? He's busy on his phone. He can answer these questions. These guys are Vernon Fisher experts here. What do? I don't. I try not to think about it too much. I think thinking can kind of be the enemy at a certain point. But generally, in a very general way, usually something pretty broad and physical will happen, and then I'll come in specifically with a drawing thing, and I'll come back and do something else pretty broad. It's nothing new. It's been going on since the beginning of Caveman. A bit of a call and response between the. I mean, it can be any number of big, broad things, but let's just say, as an example, maybe a big splash or a stain, or sometimes I'll collage a big shape on there, and then I'll just sort of go back and forth between big and small, or broad and specific, and there's always mark making involved. Drawing leads me to the next thing, and for me, the biggest trick is to not think too much about it.
right? And
Generally,
how many paintings do you have going at one time? Like, what do you?
Great question. Yeah. It's changing a little bit, but for many years, I had 3 or 4 large paintings going on at the same time. And now what I just recently realized is I still sometimes have 3 or 4 paintings up at the same time, but I'm generally working on 1 or 2 at the same time, and recently 1, because I've got so many little works on paper happening on a separate wall. So there's always multiple things going on, but yeah.
So you're using your small paintings like a sketchbook, like to get started on your big paintings.
These little ones that you've got up here, they're all finished and resolved, and I consider them their own individual finished works of art. But they have, again, it's just like drawing, having a daily drawing practice of some sort. They're all about mark making, and it's just a very soothing, appeasing thing. And so yeah, I'm lately, I think it's just maybe it's getting better to know myself. There's been some times where I've just had one big painting going and I want to start it and finish it, and I think maybe that's happening. This is the first time I said this out loud, but maybe that's happening a bit more now because I have less of a tendency to overwork and labor over anything going on in the studio based on just experience,
Right.
In doing research, if you go to the press section of his website, there are some videos there that are very enlightening. And I remember one in particular where he goes to a blank canvas and he kind of does this with the marker.
I'm playing
and he
around
does
there, by the
this
way.
and this. That's not the real thing.
No, I actually, I have to say, and there's
I'm
been
depressed.
some comments on it. You can pull them up. I'm beating a stick on a puddle of paint, and I'm just being really ridiculous. It's not really the way I start. It's not a ritual or a habit to my studio practice. I'm just that was shameless promotion that everyone on Instagram eats up and thinks that that's what I do every day.
Anyway,
It's-
you can explore those and
yeah, but
find
whatever.
some
I mean, I don't
videos.
really.
Really
It's just
worth
me
bottom
being.
sludge.
It's just me being silly. You start. I mean, the one thing that I haven't really talked about that's actually probably one of the most important things I'll say tonight is both in those videos I'm alluding to and in everything I do with the work is you got to be be able to be playful and have fun and not lose your sense of humor and be ridiculous and not be embarrassed to do something stupid. Because I think when you lose that sort of humor, that sense of humor, or some sort of playfulness in your work or the way you work, you're kind of up the creek without a paddle, so to speak, So, yeah. Yes.
I have a question about the works that you refer to as portraits.
Uh-huh.
Are they portraits in the sense of being visual and emotional distillations of a particular person's personality, or are they portraits simply in the sense that you're calling them that because of they had
You see a face.
rudimentary elements of the human face in them?
Both.
Both? Interesting.
Yeah, you can't avoid making a portrait in a way, you know? I mean, even if you're not making art, you know, the way you move through the world, the way you eat, the way you walk and talk, it's, I mean, yeah, I mean, the way they're made is a self-reflection, you know? In a less direct way than if you're seeing an eye or eyes, a nose, or a mouth. So the answer is both.
Interesting. One more question.
Yeah.
What do you consider cheap in terms of studio space in Houston? What is cheap? I mean,
You know, y'all, I'm really not Matt Adams might know that better than me. He's, at this point, I don't know what I think is cheap here has changed in the last couple of years, but I could be,
Yeah, tell
I
me
could
about
be
it.
way off because I don't know what's been going on since the flood last year, but I think
Probably.
$600 a month is cheap, you know,
If you can
but
find it.
yeah, but I don't know. Some people think closer to $1,000. I am really not the guy to ask at this particular moment. There's almost everyone in the crowd's probably better suited to answer that question.
I'm going to bring up something that I can't believe you didn't mention, and everybody's going to say, oh, why did that woman mention that? I used to run into you at the Y all the time.
Right.
And I only know one other artist who exercised as much as you, and I was married to him. And it really clears the head. Do you still exercise?
Yes.
Where do you exercise in New York?
At a couple different YMCA's in New York. I go to the same class there that I do here, which is the boot camp, cardio strength interval
Yeah.
training.
I used to run into you just
Yeah.
dripping wet.
Yeah, it's
down
brutal.
there.
Lots of burpees and push-ups and running stairs and I run on my own.
New York, you're up and down the sub.
Yeah, and you're up. Well, in New York, you're walking and taking stairs all the time. In addition to doing that, it's funny. I told my mom one time. My mom's here. I called my mom one time and I told her it's a workout just to get to the gym to work out in New York City.
Right.
But listen, that's a human thing. I do think that. Wow. Well, I'll say this. I mean, when you live in the art world, there's a lot of people who think it's a very sexy, glamorous, wine-splashed environment, and I guess it certainly can be, but like, if again, whether you're a plumber or an artist or an accountant or whatever, I mean, you know, if you really want to get things done, you got to be in good shape. If you want to, you don't need to be in good shape to get things done, but if you really want to stay healthy so that you can get things done at a higher level in a longer period of time, you have to do stuff like that. But I'm not really I'm not really the guy, that lifestyle guru. This is what you eat, this is what you do, this is how you do it. But that's very important for me just as a human on Earth to go to that stuff. And it's funny that you mentioned that. I mean, I was just watching this Gary Shandling documentary on HBO, and you know, he was, and granted he died kind of young, I guess, but he was into boxing and stuff, and yeah, you know, I mean, so yeah. Anything else? I'm a Libra. I'm 6 feet tall.
I am a little bit curious about how you come to resolution with your bigger paintings. Like how these are clear. I mean, but on your bigger paintings, like how do you resolve it?
It's a great question. And Karen, I saw you, but I mean, I solve them. The way I solve them isn't that different than the way I solve these. It's just it's a larger scale. Really, the recipe just gets more complicated. I can throw more ingredients into the recipe, so to speak, most of the time. And sometimes those ingredients are very indirect, because, as an example, you know, like this isn't that much busier than a small one, but there's a new consideration with the physicality of the material that I'm putting on there that I don't really put in the small one. Like that's all, the newer work isn't paper, sculptural paper on a canvas. I'm taking canvas and either raw canvas or unresolved old paintings and cutting them up and collaging those into the surface. So with this one I treated the canvas to make it look like black leather or vinyl with rivets in it or grommets in it. And just that sounds pretty simple, but just coming to that sort of throwing that ingredient to the recipe was a little bit more complicated, and it took a few days, if not a couple of weeks, to sort of go there with that material that I'd used in a different way before. Because also, there's a little bit more spinning in your head when you scale up. You've got more room to play. So, but I in recent work, another thing when we're talking about maturity is I still think the larger ones are still kind of simple. There's just they don't feel that much terribly visually busier, but the way I approach them is I don't really know if I'm articulating that very clearly. It's the first time I've had a hard time answering a question. I resolve them in a similar way that I do the smaller ones. They generally take longer because the scale is larger, and I'm throwing in more. I'm using more things in my vocabulary in the process of making them. Did that answer the question?
Are these, so when these are finished, then they hang on the wall, they're not stretched, they're just hanging?
Off a couple of nails. Yeah, a couple of grommet holes, the same kind of holes you'd see in a flag, up a flagpole. And with this newer work, I'm really interested in the physicality of the material that I've been so ever long invested in. And so they drape, and I'm also working on stretch paintings now too while I'm working on these, but these are meant to reiterate the physicality of material and drape and hang in a very permissible sort of carefree way, because I'm feeling a little bit more permissible and carefree with everything I'm doing in the studio because I've grown confident over the years compared to when I first started out,
It's that matter of working all the time again and gaining that confidence.
I have no secrets other than that. I know that's not a sexy answer, and there's a million other artists who will give you a million other quotes about that, but I mean, I keep it pretty straightforward when it comes to that and how I've had success, with that. So, yeah, hold on, Karen, and then the gentleman in the white shirt.
Okay, then you talked about you're moving your studio within Houston. So are you going to be coming back once in a while to paint?
Yeah, so what happened was I moved up there a year and a half ago, and I kept the studio here for several reasons. And these are much better problems than I used to have, but I've been back and forth a lot more than I planned due to exhibition opportunities and other opportunities here in Texas. So like, I didn't plan it that way. That's just sort of the way it worked out. And one of the things I've sort of realized in recent years is you've got to be fluid and be ready to pivot, So that's, yeah, and the studio here doubles as a storage unit. A lot of this is very big work, and it's created, and it didn't make sense for me to literally move everything up there and close up shop. And plus, quite frankly, my collector base is in Texas, and it's easier. A lot of them want to see work and talk to me about the work, and so it just made sense to sort of keep that going here. This time last year I had a show in Dallas, a gallery in Dallas, and it was a really beautiful large space, and I made 3 9-foot by 7.5-foot paintings for that show, and I could never have made them. I shouldn't say never. It would have been so much harder to make them on the 3rd floor of my East Harlem studio and hoist them over a fire escape and ship them from New York City down here. Much easier to get them from Houston to Dallas through a couple of double doors, So yeah, I mean that's sort of the deal there. So.
We can take one more question. Anybody? One more?
You sort of touched on what I was curious about was these bigger dimensional pieces. How do you store them? How many can you hang at once? If someone was to visit the studio, how many can you show? How do you transport them?
If you buy it, I'll show a lot.
Can't roll it.
I can't roll these. Like I have a bunch of rolled canvases from older paintings that are rolled up. Some of these, I have a really wonderful studio assistant here in town who helps me strategically hang some of them, not all of them, on not directly on top of each other, but stack them irregularly against the wall. So it's just a clever solution to the problem. That's one solution to the ones that are not crated. So like that middle area there, and where you see the orange outline of the raw black painted canvas in the center of this piece, it's as chaotic or slapdash or messy as it looks. It's all very specific and intentional, and I don't want that getting flattened or creased. So there might be, that one's actually on the top of the pile right now, but there's another one, there could be another one on top of it, but it would hang a little further to the left or the right to spare that area. And then there's another one where it's, that sort of precious area might be at the top or the bottom. So we kind of get really strategic and a little bit clever about it. And then the ones that are crated, they tend to be in gigantic styrofoam crates with interior wooden, not full interior wooden walls, but interior wooden slats. And then we screw them through the 4 grommet holes on all 4 corners into the interior wall of the crate so they're immobilized. So like some of these big ones went to Art on Paper in New York last year, and we wanted to immobilize them within the interior wall of the crate. So you just screw it into all 4 corners. It's actually a very simple solution. I didn't come up with that. I'm not the handyman. And so that's how, and then we also, can you hold this for just 1 second? So then there's one on this, this is the interior wall of the crate, and here's another interior wall of the crate. So a lot of times to save space, we have one screwed in to this wall, and then one screwed into this wall. So you can get 2 into a crate. And then you measure how sculptural the surface is, and you build the crate somewhat accordingly, although we do swap them around. So again, it's pretty simple and straightforward if you actually see it. I could draw a diagram in 30 seconds that explains it even more, but I didn't come up with that.
Will you sign it?
I didn't design it.
Will you sign it?
Will you
Oh,
sign it?
the crate? Yeah. I don't build the crates. I've never been a really great builder. So yeah. I'll be more than happy to hang out for a little bit after. I know the clock is ticking, but if anyone has any other questions, I'll be around for a couple of minutes.
If you want to join us at 13:08, please do. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Howard, and thank you, Donna. This has been, I think, fantastic.
And everybody who's at 1308 is 4 blocks down this very